1958, a young graduate student at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago was assigned to a research team and given a task that he would not speak about publicly for nearly 40 years. His job was to calculate the expected visibility of a nuclear detonation on the surface of the moon as observed from Earth, including the expansion rate of the dust cloud, the behavior of debris in lunar gravity, and the intensity of the flash as seen through the atmosphere. He was 29 years old. His name was Carl Sagan, the man who would become the most famous science communicator in American history, the man who spent his career arguing for the wonder and fragility of life in the cosmos, began that career by calculating how best to explode a nuclear weapon on the only celestial body visible from every child's bedroom window. The project had a classified designation. It was funded by the United States Air Force. What it reveals about the psychology of a nation in the grip of existential fear is far more disturbing than the bomb itself. But to understand why anyone in the United States government seriously considered detonating a nuclear warhead on the moon, you have to go back to a night in October that changed the meaning of the sky. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It weighed 184 pounds. It was a polished metal sphere, barely 23 inches in diameter. It transmitted a simple radio pulse that could be picked up by amateur radio operators worldwide. It triggered a crisis of confidence in the United States that is difficult to overstate from a modern perspective. The Soviets had not merely launched a satellite. They had demonstrated the capability to place an object into orbit using a rocket powerful enough to deliver a nuclear warhead to any city in the United States within 30 minutes. American radar systems, built to detect bombers approaching over the horizon at subsonic speeds, were useless against a ballistic missile falling from space. Overnight, the strategic calculus of the Cold War shifted. The oceans that had protected America since its founding were no longer barriers. Space was now a domain of warfare, and the Soviet Union had arrived there first. The American response was frantic. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was created in 1958. Funding for missile programs was accelerated. The education system was overhauled to produce more scientists and engineers. But within the classified corridors of the Air Force Special Weapons Center at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a smaller, darker response was taking shape. A group of physicists and military planners began studying whether the United States could demonstrate its nuclear and missile capability in the most visible way imaginable, by detonating a nuclear device on the surface of the moon. The project was initiated in May of 1958, under the leadership of Leonard Rifle, a physicist at the Armor Research Foundation, which was the research arm of the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. The study was classified and carried a deliberately bland designation to avoid attracting attention. The team was small, roughly 10 researchers, and their task was not to determine whether the United States should detonate a bomb on the moon, but whether it could and what the observable effects would be. Pay close attention to that distinction because it matters. The technical questions were significant. Could an intercontinental ballistic missile of the era carry a nuclear warhead with sufficient accuracy to impact the lunar surface? What would a nuclear detonation look like on the moon, given the absence of atmosphere? Would there be a visible flash? Would there be a mushroom cloud? How long would the debris plume remain visible from Earth through optical telescopes? What would the scientific instruments of the era be able to detect? The answers were sobering and strange in equal measure. A nuclear detonation on the lunar surface would behave nothing like a detonation on Earth. Without an atmosphere to create a shock wave or a mushroom cloud, the explosion would produce a brief, intense flash of light, followed by a rapidly expanding cloud of lunar dust and vaporized rock, ejected in all directions at tremendous velocity. In the moon's gravity, roughly 1/6 that of Earth, this debris would rise to considerable height, potentially tens of kilometers, and spread over a wide area before slowly settling back to the surface over the course of minutes. The flash itself, depending on the yield of the weapon, would be visible to the naked eye from Earth for a brief moment, perhaps 1 or 2 seconds, a sudden pinpoint of light on the terminator line between the sunlit and dark portions of the lunar disk. Through telescopes, the dust cloud could remain observable for several minutes, a ghostly bloom expanding in silence across the gray regolith. The weapon considered for the project was a small nuclear device with a yield in the low kiloton range, similar to the W-25 warhead used in the air-to-air Genie rocket, with an approximate yield of 1.5 kilotons. This was roughly 1/10 the yield of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The choice of a relatively small weapon was driven not by restraint, but by the payload limitations of the intercontinental ballistic missiles available in 1958. The Atlas missile, which was still in its testing phase, could theoretically deliver a warhead to translunar trajectory, but accuracy was a serious concern. Missing the moon entirely was a real possibility, and the geopolitical humiliation of a failed attempt would be worse than never attempting it at all. If that calculation strikes you as absurd, remember the era. This was a government that was simultaneously testing nuclear weapons in the Nevada desert at a rate of roughly 1 detonation every 3 weeks, irradiating its own citizens downwind, and considering it an acceptable cost of deterrence. Rifle's team produced a series of reports throughout 1958 and into 1959. The studies addressed blast dynamics, radiation effects, contamination of the lunar surface, detectability from Earth, and the potential scientific value of the detonation, specifically whether it could yield useful seismological data about the moon's interior structure. Carl Sagan, then a doctoral candidate, contributed calculations on the visibility of the dust cloud and the spectroscopic signature of the explosion. His involvement was not publicly known until Sagan's biographer, Key Davidson, uncovered the connection in 1999, 7 years after the project itself was first disclosed by Rifle in a newspaper interview in 2000. Now here is where the story turns. The project was never approved for execution. By late 1959, the Air Force quietly shelved the study. The reasons were multiple, and they reveal a rare moment of institutional restraint in an era not known for it. First, the scientific community within the project itself raised objections. Contaminating the lunar surface with radioactive debris would compromise future scientific missions to the moon, missions that were already being planned under what would become the Apollo program. Whatever short-term propaganda value a nuclear flash might provide, the long-term cost to lunar science would be permanent and irreversible. Second, the risk of failure was unacceptable. A missile launch aimed at the moon that went wrong, whether the warhead detonated in Earth orbit, fell back to the surface, or simply missed its target, would be a catastrophe of global proportions. The political damage of a failed nuclear moonshot would dwarf any benefit from a successful one. Third, and perhaps most importantly, senior officials began to recognize that the propaganda value of the gesture was far less than it appeared. Detonating a bomb on the moon would demonstrate destructive capability, but it would not demonstrate the technological sophistication that the American public and the international community actually craved. Putting a human being on the moon and bringing them home alive, that would demonstrate mastery. Blowing a hole in the lunar surface would demonstrate fear. It would be seen not as strength, but as desperation. A nation so threatened by a rival satellite that it resorted to bombing the moon. The optics, even in 1958, were terrible. The project files were classified and placed in storage. The researchers returned to their other work. Sagan went on to complete his doctorate at the University of Chicago, studying planetary atmospheres, and eventually became a professor at Cornell University, where he spent the remainder of his career advocating for the peaceful exploration of space. He never publicly discussed his involvement in the project during his lifetime, though he reportedly mentioned it in academic appointment applications, which constituted a security breach that briefly concerned the Air Force, but was never formally pursued. Think about that detail for a moment. The man who told a generation of Americans that we are all made of star stuff, who argued that the Earth was a pale blue dot deserving of protection and humility, launched his career by modeling the physics of nuclear violence against the moon, and then spent the rest of his life working to ensure that such violence would never be carried out. Leonard Riefel lived until 2017, passing away at the age of 89. In his later years, he spoke openly about the project, describing it as a product of the fear and competitive mania that defined the early Cold War. He noted that the team understood even at the time that the project was morally questionable, but that the pressure from the Air Force to produce results left little room for philosophical debate. He expressed relief that the project was never carried out, and stated that the decision to cancel it was one of the few moments of genuine wisdom he witnessed during his years in classified weapons research. The moon remains unbombed. The 12 human beings who eventually walked on its surface between 1969 and 1972 did so in the name of peaceful exploration, carrying scientific instruments instead of warheads, planting flags instead of craters. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and over 100 other nations, explicitly prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in space or on any celestial body. The treaty exists in part because of conversations that began in the very years when the project was under consideration, conversations driven by the growing recognition that the Cold War could not be allowed to follow humanity beyond the atmosphere. The documents were eventually declassified. They sit in archives near dry technical reports filled with equations describing blast radii in vacuum, debris trajectories in 1/6 gravity, and the luminous intensity of a kiloton-class detonation as observed from 239,000 miles away. They read like the homework assignments of a civilization that had briefly lost its mind and then, just barely, found it again in time to look up at the moon on a clear night and decide that some things are better left unbroken.